If you have topics you would like to have us discuss on the Aging Well podcast, please click on the links in the episode description to send us a text or record your message or comments. We'd love to hear from you and how we can help you age well. If you benefit from the Aging Well podcast and would like to support the content financially, please click on the Support the Show link or support our affiliates and advertisers. Welcome to the Aging Well podcast. I'm Jeff Armstrong here with Corbin Bruton. In this and the episodes that follow, we will share candid discussions on aging and hear from the experts. We are here to inform and encourage as we experience, aging.
So let's dive back to some of our previous podcasts where in a lot of them, we've talked about the basic 5 exercises. And I was wondering if we could possibly talk about different variations of each one of those basic 5s and what our favorites would be and what could be beneficial for our listeners, depending on which route they'd like to go.
Sounds good. Now, for somebody who might just be joining us for the first time, the basic 5 are 5 lifts that are essential for building strength, no matter whether you're an athlete, an aging adult, a beginning lifter, a teenager, whatever it might be. And those are the squat, the deadlift, which we would also consider the hip hinge, the bench press, the row, and the overhead press. And we've also talked about sometimes we can break that into 7 movements, but those 7 movements are incorporated into those particular activities. And those are, again, the squat, the hip hinge, horizontal press, horizontal pull, vertical push, vertical pull. And we also kind of include the carries in there, but the carries I think are a little bit more secondary. And so, I think that's a great topic to talk about. I think it's a lot more than we can probably really cover in a single episode of the podcast. Mm-hmm. So maybe we just start with one of those movement patterns. And I think probably a good one to start with would be the squat, because that's such a foundational exercise and probably one that people are a little less familiar with what they can do with that particular exercise. Because like bench press, rows, overhead press, those are pretty basic, pretty straightforward for many people, but the squat can be a little bit more complicated. Do you have a favorite squat variation?
Well, obviously the classic squat where it's on your back and you have the bar. I'm a low bar individual. I love squatting low bar where it's, instead of it being high bar where it sits kind of on top of my shoulders next to my neck, I like to go low bar where it's in the middle of my shoulders. But if I don't have a squat rack and I don't have the luxury of having a bar, one of my favorite variations of the squat is actually that goblet squat, where I'll take a really heavy weight, just a single dumbbell. I'll hold it right in between my hands, right by my collarbone, and then I squat down. And when I was actually doing a lot of personal training, I noticed that in order for individuals to get that good form and good technique as far as squats go, the goblet squat was a great way to do that, because as they were squatting down, that weight in front of them was actually being able to use as a counterweight. So a lot of people, when they do squats, they kind of like curve their back and they lean forward. By having that weight in front of them, it allowed that core to be nice and tight, and it was allowing them to sit back, getting a lot lower and a lot deeper, engaging the hamstrings, quads, and glutes when they would come up.
Okay, and a couple of things in response there. I mean, first thing I think what we should tell the listeners is that we will try and link a few videos, because obviously this is an audio podcast.
Right.
Might be a little bit harder to visualize some of these exercises, but we'll link some videos to demonstrate some of the different lifts that we might talk about. You mentioned kind of high bar versus low bar back squat. I don't get all mixed up in the whole high bar, low bar, which is better, which is preferred, primarily because not everybody can do a high bar or a low bar. There's generally a comfortable position for everybody with that squat bar. Like for myself, I have a very large C7 spinous process. That's the bone sticking off the back of the lowest cervical vertebra. And if I go in a high bar position, I'm resting on that bone and it is extremely uncomfortable. And I have a more natural spot just above the spine of the scapula that, the muscle just kind of pads the bar and it's a comfortable spot for me. And so I generally am always in that spot. And it's probably a little bit closer to being considered a low bar squat.
That would be low bar.
Yeah. But, I think it's more a matter of comfort. You get a slight variation in what muscle groups are going to be most activated in a high versus a low bar squat. But there's a lot of other factors to kind of consider with that, whether you have a long trunk and, what are your limb proportions and everything else. And I think for the average listener, you can get really kind of messed up and mired up in all the mess that comes with the arguments that we hear sometimes from lifters in regards to which is better, high bar versus low bar, and what you should be doing for this and that. It's like the most important thing is to be able to squat properly. And, you mentioned the goblet squat being a great beginning squat to get somebody good at technique. I think when it comes to technique, the first thing we need to do is drop down into that, what they consider more of a primal squat position. This is a squat position. People who, live in some of these societies or cultures that don't have chairs like we, and, these first world countries, are always sitting our butts down in chairs. They got to, if they're taking a break from working in the fields or whatever, they're squatting down and eating their food in a squat position. And that's where your feet are going to be planted flat on the ground. Your butt is dropped down as low as it can so that essentially your thighs are resting on your calves and you're in a comfortable position. You can sit for extended periods of time. And so I have people just drop down into that position. They space their feet so they're going to be comfortable and able to get as low as possible. So that automatically shifts their feet into the proper angles. Because that's another thing you'll hear people say, your feet should be positioned at 15 degrees or 30 degrees. And people argue back and forth. It's like,
False.
No, that's different for everybody, right? And, same thing for the depth of the squat. I mean, we'll often use the phrase ass to grass, meaning that your butt is down as low as possible. Very few people can actually go a true ass to grass where their butt is going to be touching the ground as they get down into a squat position. But we can all get into our deepest squat position. And to find that, we just kind of get in that position where we can kind of rest the elbows between the legs. We can get our bodies down. Our butt is down as low as possible. We get as much flexion at the ankle, the knee, and the hip. And that is our bottom squat position. There's a little bit of discussion as to how vertical the back should be in a squat. And I think, again, that becomes a body proportion kind of thing. The goblet squat will teach you to be much more vertical, which allows you a little bit of opportunity to become a little bit more flexed forward as you go heavier so that you can incorporate the glutes a little bit more into that movement. So I do like the goblet squat for a beginner. And you can use a kettlebell or you can use a dumbbell. One reason I would favor the dumbbell, especially an adjustable dumbbell, is you can progress the weight a little bit. Or if you have a set of dumbbells, you can progress through that set. But most sets generally don't go very high. So you kind of get up to 50. Like the dumbbell set I have, fixed dumbbell set that I have goes up to 70 pounds. I can very easily do a goblet squat with 70 pounds. Then what do I do from there? And so it is great for a beginner, somebody who's building basic strength, or if you're going to be doing something like a high intensity interval resistance training workout and you're going just kind of high reps or as many reps as possible in a timed constraint, goblet squats are pretty good. Kettlebells become a little bit more expensive to have those gradations of progression. So I'm not a huge kettlebell fan, not anything against the kettlebell aficionados and people that really love kettlebells. I do think they have their place. I just think they kind of price my Scottish blood out a little bit, where it's just too expensive to have enough kettlebells. And so, yeah, the goblet squat is really, really good for teaching beginners to get that proper technique. And if somebody can't do a really good back squat, even just like with a bar, or even an unweighted back squat. And goblet squat's a really good teaching technique. And then once you get progressed to a weight that gets heavy enough that the dumbbell is going to be very uncomfortable, or they're not going to be able to hold a dumbbell, then you're going to have to shift to something else. And that's when the back squat might be good. I think a alternative that I've seen before, but I've really begun to practice it more, and I'm having my wrestlers use it in the strength conditioning program that we're doing, is the Zercher squat. And are you familiar with the Zercher squat?
I am now. I am as of today.
Yeah. So the Zercher squat, it's an interesting exercise, and it looks extremely uncomfortable, and it can be uncomfortable. It's like doing a goblet squat, but you're going to hold a weighted bar in the crease of the elbow, and you're standing in a much more upright position, and you're going to hold that bar in front of you and then drop down into a squat and then stand back up from it. And so it forces you into a little bit more of a vertical position. Like you said, with the goblet squat, it's going to pull the shoulders back a little bit more. You can round the shoulders a little bit if you're in an incorrect position, and that may not be as critical for, like strongman athletes and things like that, people that are going to be lifting the Atlas stone. And if our listeners aren't familiar with the Atlas stone, that's okay. Most of us aren't going to be lifting them. Those are just those big cement spheres that strongman athletes have to lift in competition, and they're really, really tough to get a grip of and to lift off the ground. And there's a technique to lifting those. But the Zercher squat, what I like about it is it's a much more natural squat.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, when we're picking something up off the ground, we are essentially most times kind of scooping it under our arms and then standing up with it. And so it is functional for the average individual, especially the older adult. It can be done with a relatively light weight to start, and you can progress from there. It is very good for athletes, particularly athletes like wrestlers that are having to kind of explode out of that position, and our arms are in that position. We're usually not doing much with weight on the back in sport. And so I find it to be a very functional exercise across the breadth of individuals that should be doing a squat-like movement.
Well, if you think about it, that particular movement, we do that in our daily lives.
Yeah.
If something's on the ground, say you're at the office and you just got a new shipment of, I don't know, really heavy supplies from Office Depot. You got to squat down to the ground, grab it in front of you, and you got to pick it up. If you're helping your buddy move his couch, like you got to squat from the ground, pick it up. If you got a really small car and you just went grocery shopping, well, you kind of have to do a slight squat and then pick up all those bags like right in front of you or out to the side. Some people hang, but
how about those moms and dads that got growing kids?
Kids?
You
Exactly.
want the best progression of a Zercher squat is have a child. And as they start walking, pick them up every day. I got to a point in life where my son would no longer let me pick him up. I think he was probably about 9, maybe. But, as the kid's getting bigger, you're doing it every day. That's progressive overload. And if you can pick your kid up, as they're 5, 6, 7 years of age and they're pushing 40, 50 pounds in weight, you're getting stronger. But I don't recommend, using your kids as dumbbells or weights for a lifting program. They have other things to do. But that, the Zercher squat I really like. The downside of it is it can be uncomfortable. Putting a bar in the crease of your elbows can be uncomfortable for many. My son was just doing Zercher squats this past week, and he's up to about 245 pounds for 3 sets of 10. Very good technique and good depth. He can even go probably a little bit heavier for fewer reps. And from a wrestling standpoint, I think where he's at is great because he's probably going to end up wrestling heavyweight this next year. And if he can lift for 1 repetition, the heaviest weight that he's going to have to lift in a match, then he's in a really good position. Mm. He's kind of got bruises across his arms now from holding the bar. He holds it without any kind of padding. I have rather short biceps. And so the tendons kind of protrude there. And so the bar against those tendons can be very painful at heavy weight. And so I'll just wrap a little padding around it. And, what I've done in the past is just go to Home Depot, Lowe's, or hardware store, or wherever it sells the piping insulation, and just get a run of that. And it's already got it's got a hole through the middle of it. So it's bored through, and it has, a cut through it to slip over the pipe. So all you have to do is slip it up over the bar, and it's going to give you a level of padding that's going to be comfortable.
Would a pool noodle be cheaper?
I was going to bring that up.
All right.
I don't know if it's cheaper per se. It might be a little bit easier to access. Mm-hmm. They're a little bit thicker. And that's what I'm currently using, because I couldn't find the pipe insulation. I didn't want to go all the way out to the Home Depot or Lowe's, and couldn't find it at a couple of more local stores. So they had pool noodles. I think they were like $2 a piece or something like that. So they're pretty cheap. Just took it home. Actually cut it into two. So I actually have two that can be used. So two lifters can use them. And then you just had to take an X-Acto knife and kind of cut your way down the middle, nice clean line to split it open. And that works great. It's a nice little cushion. I've seen athletes that will use the squat pads, which I'm not a big fan of squat pads, the neck rolls. You can use those as long as they're wide enough that you can keep your arms about, shoulder width, because you want to keep them out a little bit more so you get a little bit more bicep activation. That's something you can do. The one video that I have in my mind to share, which is Christian Turbido with T-Nation. I think it's with T-Nation. But he uses just his neoprene knee sleeves that he uses for squatting. Now, I don't recommend for our older adult listeners to maybe go out and buy neoprene sleeves. The pool noodle will be a lot cheaper. But if you have those, or any other kind of padding, you can wrap a towel around it, just anything to kind of give it a little bit of cushion, hold it in that position, and you're just going to squat down. You get as low as you can. You might have to kind of bring the elbows in a little bit tighter to kind of split them out. But one thing I've found that I like with the Zercher squat is that it does cause the person to activate the hips a little bit more, because you got to push the knees out as you're squatting down, rather than letting the knees cave in or being too straightforward with your legs. And so you get a little bit wider down in the squat position. It's easier to drop down low. And then like the goblet squat, you get a much better technique. You're using the upper back. You're bracing a lot more. So when you start doing Zercher squats or goblet squats, you're going to feel it in the core a lot more. You're going to feel more abdominal work. And if you're going after the six-pack abs, which, we don't have to have, they're not necessary. And again, if you really want six-pack abs, it's a lot of weight loss more than doing Zercher squats or goblet squats. But it's going to help strengthen the abdominal muscles to a much, much greater extent, maybe even more so than the squat. And it's a good little exercise, and you can progress from it. You can just keep adding weight to it. You might have to start a little bit lighter and just add weight as you're capable. I discussed my epigenetics test with True Diagnostic co-founder Hannah Wendt in episode 162. Epigenetic testing measures baseline and changes in your pace of aging, giving you the power to steer your anti-aging or health and wellness journey in the right direction. I learned that I am aging well. Click on the affiliate link in the episode description, use the promo code AGEWELL, and receive a 12% discount on your epigenetics test and monitor your pace of aging.
Well, speaking of adding weight, let's talk about no weights. I think no weights with the squat, like air squats or whatever the case, I think it's really important to master the actual squat and be in tune with your body. Now, we did talk, you mentioned earlier that at some point in time, every single person has the ability to do the squat, because if you look at a little kid, right, that's their very first movement. That's their first exercise. Is you see them, they just
first movement.
Well,
first movement is actually a bowel movement.
Well, Every little kid can do that squat. They take their butt and they drop it down and they're sitting comfortably. Over time, especially in my opinion, in the Western culture, we kind of lose that flexibility. We kind of lose that mobility. As a little kid, we're really like agile and able to move around. And then over time, we kind of become more robotic, more stiff. So I think that a really good one to, if you don't have the hip flexibility, because we mentioned earlier that there are a lot of people say you got to have your toes facing forward, and some people say toes out, and some people say toes in. It kind of all depends on your hip flexibility, doesn't it?
Yeah, but I don't know about anybody having their toes in on a squat. Unless you have a really messed up hip structure, your toes are not going to be in. Then it's going to be some degree of outwardness, and very unlikely that it'll be straightforward. Again, everybody has different hip structures. I would suspect if you took a dancer, a career dancer, and had them squat, their toes are going to be pointed out very far because, they have just hips like that. Some people might be a little bit more square, but again, everybody's hip is a little bit different. And so that needs to be considered.
So if you're wanting to get down lower, and you haven't quite, maybe a good way to loosen that up would be to put some plates underneath your heels, or maybe a 2x4 or something to allow you to slowly drop it. It's kind of a modified. I see you're kind of disagreeing with this.
I'm not a fan of accommodating for bad mechanics. Now, to a certain extent, like if you look at weightlifting shoes for power lifters or Olympic lifters, they are a little bit more elevated, but they are a harder soled shoe. They're a little bit more elevated to put you in a better position to get to that depth, but it doesn't fix the problem. So, that assists in the lift itself. Most lifters are still going to be working on mobility to be able to perform their movements through the full range of motion. But when you start putting weights under your heels, you're not fixing the problem. And oftentimes the problem is mobility issues, and it might be ankle mobility. And there are a lot of other things that you can do to improve your ankle mobility. And by ankle mobility, we're talking about not only, you don't really need to push up on your toes, high plantar flexion when you're squatting. You're literally really not doing that. But you're dorsiflexing, where the top of your foot is coming toward your knees. And so when you squat down, your knees will go over your toes. I think we need to kind of get out of that mentality as well. I think we've done a lot of damage in the past in exercise science where we said, don't squat with your knees over your toes. Well, that's maybe good for some people, but it really limited the depth of the squat. And it didn't take into account that everybody's mechanics are a little bit different. I have very long thighs. My femurs are very long. I'm going to squat with my knees out over my toes. But to do that, I have to be able to plantar flex pretty well. So I have to be able to bend at the ankle with good mobility. And that can get tight in a lot of individuals because, again, we don't have any visuals to show this when we're doing it audibly, but, the bone structure of the ankle is, the tibia and the fibula fitting around the bones of the calcaneus. And as the foot goes into plantar flexion, those bones come into contact with each other, and that limits the range of motion. But if we can get the ankle to slip forward a little bit more, then it opens up that range of motion. Actually, no, it's to pull backwards a little bit more so that you get more dorsiflexion. And a simple thing that you can do is to have like bands around your ankles fixed to something in front of you and go into that dorsiflexion position. The tibia and the fibula are going to be pulled forward, and it's going to open up that ankle joint and allow you to move into a fuller range of motion. And so we can open up that ankle and give us better ankle mobility. Other things that we can do, and which I encourage people to do before they squat, is to just simply drop down into that primal squat position and kind of just roll your ankles around a little bit, force yourself into a little bit more dorsiflexion, get everything warmed up and loose that you're improving that range of motion before you start really weighting yourself heavy. And if we work on the ankle mobility, we're working on hip mobility and your knee flexibility, you're going to be able to squat deeper. You're not going to need to put that weight under your ankles. And my recommendation would be squat the weight that you can go down deepest in your full range of motion without any kind of assistance, and then build from there, maintaining and improving that range of motion rather than trying to accommodate for it. So I'm not a believer in putting anything under the heels in order to assist in the squat. You're not really doing anything. You're changing some of the basic mechanics of the lever arms to change it, but you're not really lifting more weight,
right?
Because the forces on the joints are still relative to the length of the movement arm and the resistance and everything. And so, if anything, you're fooling yourself that you're lifting more weight. Just dump the ego at the door, go to the gym, lighten up the load, and do a proper squat. And don't add weight until you can continue to do a proper squat. There's nothing impressive, to me at least, about seeing somebody do a less than 90-degree squat with a ton of weight on their back. It's, oh yeah, I got a PR today. It's like, no, you didn't. You did a really crappy squat. Just because you posted on Instagram does not make it a good squat. So do the squat right. And, if you need to modify the exercise in order to do it right, then do that. If a back squat limits you, maybe you have back pain, or you're just because of your structure, you're not very good at back squatting and you just find it very difficult to go down deep, build up that strength through a full range of motion by doing something like a goblet squat or Zercher squat, or any of the other variations. I mean, obviously there will need to be much more adaptability for somebody, say, who has one limb or has an injured limb, or other kind of impaired functions that might limit them from being able to do a technically proper squat. But we could talk more on those, or obviously I think we have the link in our episode notes that if somebody has a question, they can click on the link and actually record a question for us to ask. If you have a specific, hey, this is an issue I have with the squatting, what should I do about it? We can address that. But there's a lot of individuality when it comes to squatting. And that's why I think having the variations that we can find most comfortable for ourselves that are going to allow us to build strength and age well by squatting is going to be important. One squat that we haven't talked about is a front squat. What do you think of the front squat?
I like this front squat. Well, I mean, it kind of ties in with the goblet squat, and then the squat which I just forgot. The Zercher squat. Yeah.
Senior moment there.
I was like, man, I can't. I like the front squat.
I don't.
I
hate the front squat, and part of it is it's wrist mobility, and I just can't seem to improve on it. It's just kind of the structure of my body. It puts it in a much more uncomfortable position.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like my limitations in doing the front squat are much more how it feels on my collarbone, how it feels on my wrists, and not being able to kind of support the weight quite as much. I feel I get a little bit better lift now out of the Zercher squat than I do out of a front squat. That being said, though, a front squat is a very good exercise, and it should be something that is worked in with the back squat because it works the muscles more differently. It shifts the leverage in the body so that the muscles being used are going to be a little bit different. Front squat is much more knee dominant, where for some individuals, the back squat could be a bit more hip dominant. And by that, we mean that we're using the quadriceps, which extend the knee in the front squat more, and we use the glutes or the butt muscles in hip extension in the back squat a little bit more. And so the emphasis in the muscles is a little bit different.
See, I don't get that. I'm like quad dominant in both. I really don't feel my glutes or my hamstrings as much unless I'm doing like the like a deadlift, Romanian style, or just a standard deadlift. But in squats, I'm like, it doesn't matter if I'm doing front or if I'm doing back squats. I feel it all in my quads. Now at the top of the squat, yeah, I do feel it in my glutes. But
so again, everybody's a little
everyone's different. Yeah.
I feel it more really in both when I squat, but I will feel a bit more quad action, particularly the gluteus medius and the vastus lateralis a little bit more in a front squat, Zercher squat than I do in a back squat. My back squat, I do tend to have a lot more forward lean, so I did get a little bit more glute work in there, and I definitely feel it in my hamstrings as I squat, as I should. I mean, you should be activating all of those muscles in the squat, but it's going to be a little bit different. And so it's one of the important factors in varying up the exercise so that we hit the muscles a little bit different. Doesn't mean that, you can't always do a back squat and still progress. I don't think that idea of varying the exercise with high frequency is at all advantageous. I think you're going to get better strength mastering one movement for, at least a training period of at least 4 weeks or so, and then change the exercise. But, if you back squat all the time, you're still going to see progress. You might not see quite as much as if you varied it up a little bit. But if you're varying the rep schemes, the number of sets and the volumes over the course of time, that's going to have an effect on improving your progress. So I don't think that matters. But I do think it's probably helpful to vary up your squats on a regular basis.
I would say it's actually going to be more helpful if you know what you're doing. A lot of people, they think that they're doing a good squat, at least in my personal experience with personal training, like individuals, they'll be like, no, I'm getting low, but really they're just kind of moving their head. I think if you have the luxury as a listener to perform a squat in front of a mirror, whether you're facing the mirror or the mirror is to the side of you and you're able to watch yourself go down, excellent. I think also with the realm of technology, film yourself, right? Film yourself going down. And sometimes we think that we're doing a good job, just like athletes. You look at the best athletes, they're always looking at ways to improve, and they'll watch themselves on film. Okay, I was messing up here, or I need to shift my hips here, or I need to do whatever. It's the exact same concept while performing a squat. Like you can, if you haven't mastered the form down, there's really no harm in trying to better yourself, trying to get into it.
Now, I would back you up there a little bit in terms of the side mirror. Don't use a side mirror to monitor your squat performance, because what are you going to do? You're going to be turning your head even ever so slightly to catch it in your peripheral vision. You're shifting your body slightly, and it's going to throw off your technique and cause some level of imbalance. I have one of my wrestlers that keeps doing that as he squats. Don't do that, because he's almost looking entirely sideways, and it's like your squat gets shifted as you're doing that. But you can use a little bit of kinesthetic awareness, proprioception, those big terms there. If somebody is having difficulty with depth, bench squats are another option, where you set a bench or
a chair or a box squat.
Well, those are all the same thing. Something that you can sit your butt down to in the squat to have a reference point for how deep you should get. Now, I'm not a big fan of actually unloading in the seated position. I feel like, be able to touch your butt and come up from that, but having some reference point that allows you to know how deep you're going. Other reference points that you can use are using the safety bars, setting that at a height just above your deepest squat position so that for one thing, if you do fail and you're not able to complete the squat, you're not trapped in a squatted position. And if you're going to be at risk of getting stuck, then you really should have a spotter when you're squatting.
Mm-hmm.
And most everybody should have a spotter as they're squatting. If you don't have the luxury of a spotter, you have to have the safety rack set up. But that gives you a better guide as well as, am I getting low enough? Now, you may perceive you may end up flexing to get down to that point, but you're going to perceive that as well. But be aware of your mechanics. Know your squat mechanics, and every squat repetition should be, within a certain variability of that exact same squat. You're robotic in your squat mechanics.
Do that though. Now, this next squat, I was always told that they were called pizza squats, but we talked earlier prior to this recording, and they're actually called what?
I've heard them called Darden squats after Ellington Darden. They're basically just a super slow squat, and you probably can name them almost anything. But yeah, so you were talking about doing a body weight squat, and it could be a weighted squat as well. I think these are a good thing to do for somebody who is maybe learning the squat, or maybe somebody coming back off an injury that can't do a weighted back squat, or is having some limitation of why they can't. Say you want to do a Zercher squat or a back squat, and you got a broken limb. You can't do either. You can still do a very slow body weight squat. And this is another reason why there's no excuse not to ever work out. You have an injury, work around it. There's some way that you can work most of your muscle groups when you are injured. But it's just, again, going through that movement pattern as slow as possible. It's like in a time warp. You're going super, super slow.
Super slow. And that's the most critical point, is when you're going down, it should be taking you 30, 45, 60 seconds to get all the way down. And the exact same thing coming back up. Again, 30, 45, 60 seconds, even longer if the more control you are. And what you're going to notice is not only is it going to burn, but you're going to feel your weak points. You're going to feel, whoa, I'm shifting right here. I'm favoring the right, or I'm favoring the left, or, ooh, my knees kind of shimmy a little bit right here. And the more you do it, you are going to get that more robotic, good form, good technique. And you just, I don't know, you're making that mind muscle connection. You're firing your neurotransmitters on a different level than you would if you're just doing squats regularly, taking it down and really slowing it down and becoming in tune with your body. This is a great one. I love it. I absolutely love it on these.
I mean, again, you're going to need a certain level of strength in order to be able to do those properly. But, if you are somebody who's just starting out, maybe for some of our listeners, we're somewhat targeted towards the aging adult, the older population, and you are a bit frail, but you can sit and stand from a chair. Just simply do that sitting and standing in a slow, controlled fashion. You build up some strength, and eventually you get to the point where that's a bit more comfortable to do, and you add some weight to that. And then as we get stronger, we can move into some of the other variations. Mm-hmm. And the whole idea is just keep progressing and doing whatever you're doing a little bit more each time. And another variation I would think of the squat that we could discuss is the Bulgarian split squat, which is just simply a single leg, rear elevated squat. So you have your back foot up on either a bench, or I like to just use kind of a bar with a pad on it that's set at a certain height, and I just kind of rest my ankle on it because it's a little bit easier than planting my foot on a bench. And it unloads that back foot and puts a lot more of the stress on the lower limb. But you can, using dumbbells, a goblet position. I mean, you could do Zercher squats with these. You can do back barbell squats with them. You can do any weight position in a Bulgarian split squat. But the idea is now you're doing it unilaterally rather than bilaterally. and you just alternate the leg.
In addition to the Bulgarian squat, where you have the leg lifted behind you, there's also another variation where the leg is out in front of you, which is a lot more advanced, but this is called the pistol squat. So you have that leg in front of you and you're squatting down, again, trying to get as low as possible and then coming up with it.
Yeah, the pistol squat's extremely advanced, and I think it's also something that is okay to kind of aspire to, but different body types and mechanics are not going to be as geared toward the pistol squat because you're basically going all the way down and doing almost ass to grass kind of squat with the one leg elevated in front of you. And they're kind of nice for show. They're not necessarily all that great for, hypertrophy and lifting. I mean, you can accomplish kind of the same things by doing the other lifts. And so, yeah, if you can do it, that's great. Do it. And if you aspire to do it, make that part of your lifting program to be able to get those mechanics to be able to do it. But don't let it become your primary focus so that you miss out on opportunity to really grow the strength and hypertrophy of the leg muscles. And you can also do just what's referred to more as a single leg squat, where you're just elevating one foot. You squat down kind of as deep as you can, and that might only be to bench height or something like that. If you can do a single leg squat down to 90 degrees, that's pretty good, a bit of a workout as well. The extent to whether that next 25 degrees of movement is going to be that important, I'm not sure that that's super important. But yeah, pistol squat's another alternative that's in there. There are different things that we can do with the weight that we're lifting during the squatting. I have a physio ball down in my garage gym that I've partially filled with water and then partially with air. So it's a slosh ball, pretty heavy ball. And so it requires a lot more control to be able to hold on to that weight. And so I'll do squat exercises with that. It's, again, not progressive. It's something I would use more for high intensity interval resistance training kind of workout, not so much for hypertrophy workout, but it does require a lot more motor control, which can make it a little bit more fun. We can do things with like medicine balls, Bulgarian bags, and holding the weight in different positions to alter the squat.
Like a briefcase squat where you have no weight on one side and you're holding either a kettlebell or a dumbbell on the other side, and you just squat down and you're still trying to stay as your shoulders and your hips as square as possible going down instead of having it pull you to the side. Yeah. You're in control on that one side, and then you just alternate.
Yeah, and those exercises, again, as you're getting stronger and stronger, they're going to be less and less effective in hypertrophying the leg muscles, but they're very good for core control and stability. It's going to help you to be better at squatting in the more traditional pathways or patterns. Lunges are another exercise that can be a variation of the squatting motion. That, you can do something other than doing a squat motion.
Well, and then lunges, that opens the door for, you got your forward lunge, reverse lunge, you got your Spider-Man lunges where you're going side to side. There's a lot of different variations with that.
And let's see, is there any others that we haven't really covered? I'm sure there's some others.
The only one I can really think of, and I haven't done this one since high school. Our high school football coach used to do this one. It was called the balance squat. And essentially you have both your arms out in front of you, and they're at your shoulder level, but they're parallel with the floor. And you have the 45-pound bar just resting right on your shoulders, right where your delts and your collarbone meet. And as you roll down, or as you squat down, that bar should not move. It shouldn't roll and choke you, and it shouldn't roll down your arms. You are to maintain that perfect squat level, and that bar should stay still. And if you lean forward or you drop your arms ever so slightly, it's going to roll off. If you're trying to squat and you lift your arms up, well, then it rolls back and it kind of chokes you a bit. I don't necessarily know if this is the most practical way of doing something, but
those are, I've always heard those referred to as the Frankenstein squats.
Well, there you see.
And those, I think they have a place at times. They're probably a little bit better for Olympic style lifters who are working to maintain a much more vertical position, which you're going to need for the clean and for the snatch. And so you need a certain amount of genetic predisposition to be able to properly do a Frankenstein squat. I can't do them very well because the way my body is structured, I have to get a little bit more forward lean, even in a front squat, to be able to get down low. And so they're not going to work as well for me. But if you have somebody who is capable of squatting with a much more vertical back and you're trying to train them and educate them to do that, then it's going to be a very effective tool. Again, it's not going to be great for hypertrophy, but it's helping to improve that technique. Now, it doesn't mean that for somebody just starting out that it's not going to be great for hypertrophy, because if you've never lifted before, that 45-pound barbell may be just enough weight to overload the muscles and to grow it. And you can continue to add weight to that. I mean, I know there are people who can Frankenstein squat a considerable amount of weight, and so it can be used for hypertrophy. So it is a reasonable alternative. Another one that I would think of with, again, with Olympic style lifting would be an overhead squat, where you're holding the barbell overhead in a vertical position, generally more in a snatch position, although it could be more in a clean press position. Those are, again, necessary for somebody who's going to be doing Olympic lifting. They are good for the core for the average individual. It's not for everybody. I have type 3 acromions, which means my acromion has a bit of a curve, quite a bit of curve to it, which closes out the shoulder capsule a little bit, which limits, doesn't necessarily limit the range of motion. I guess it probably does a little bit, but it will tend to, whenever the arms are in an overhead position, it compresses the structures within the shoulder capsule and increases my risk of shoulder pain, shoulder injury. Fortunately, I didn't do a lot of athletics that required overhead work, and so my rotator cuff was spared pretty much into my 40s. Currently having some issues with my left rotator cuff. Not sure if it's the cuff itself or my shoulder labia, but I try and avoid too much overhead kind of work. And so I don't encourage people to do a lot of overhead squats unless they're going to be doing Olympic lifting or they need to be doing things that are going to put them in that position, because it can be stressful on the shoulders. But that being said, it can be a very good alternative to the squat for the right individuals, for the right purposes. Trying to think, are we missing any others? I know there's probably some freaky variations that are out there that, because, you look at some of these articles in the different magazines, the squat you're never doing that you should be doing, right?
Jump squats.
Okay, again, jump squats are probably a little bit outside of the aging well realm. Those are a bit more for athletes. I'm not a huge fan of jump squats with the barbell on the back.
No.
Because it does put a lot of compression on the vertebra. Although people will do that. I would prefer to do that with something more like a sandbag, a Bulgarian bag, or something on the back, or doing them with, say, like a hex bar, which is another squat variation that we did not mention, which is the hex bar squat. And for those who might not know what a hex bar is, it is simply a bar that is shaped like a hexagonal. It's got 6 sides to it. Hex. I just wanted to make sure that in my mind that it was actually 6 sides. And then you attach the barbell, so you're gripping at your sides, and that kind of moves the squat into a bit of that gray area between a deadlift and a squat, but it definitely helps unload the vertebral column. So for people with back issues or just where heavy squatting over a long period of time is starting to aggravate the back a little bit.
I know
You
one
can go into
that we didn't. I mean, we kind of talked about this as far as what angle your feet are at, but then we didn't talk about what length your feet should be, because there is the
What
wide
length
squat.
your feet are you're gonna
Yeah,
do?
there's
That's
the wide.
decided by your parents. I mean, I'm a
No,
size
I'm
12
talking
and
about
a
there's
half,
the
13.
wide squat, right, where your legs are out way past shoulder width, and then you're squatting down. There's the normal one where you're right around shoulder width, maybe a little bit more, depending on your height. And then there's the narrow squat, where you're a lot more narrow and you're able to squat down.
Yeah, and I think it's what are you trying to accomplish? Are you trying to hit muscles a little bit differently? The biomechanics in there are somewhat questionable, whether you're really getting much added benefit. So like the adductors, the muscles in the inner thigh, if you go really wide, some will say, if you get really narrow, you're working, I believe it's more the vastus medialis. I personally think that just gets a bit too complicated to be concerned with, and that you should just kind of find your foot position, and I'm a much more narrow stance on mine because that's what I need to do to be able to get the deepest depth in my squat. And I get greater strength for some reason coming out of the squat in that position. So I have a bit more slightly narrower than shoulder width position. Some people go a little bit wider.
That's crazy because you're so tall. I would think that you'd be a little.
It just makes me have to work that much harder in my squat. But strangely, I can kind of lift more. I get through that fuller range of motion. And that's overall better for my chicken legs to squat that full depth range of motion. If I try and go wide, my hips I don't have the right mechanics for it. Little wider than shoulder width doesn't work for me. But again, that's why I say just find that foot position, drop down into that primal squat position, shuffle your feet around until you feel your hips are comfortable, you're as low as you can possibly be, and where your heels are relative to your shoulders, how your toes are pointing out, that's where you need to set up your squat every time you squat. And you're going to have the most effective growth and strengthening progression doing that. And if you do that, you just set up that same position every time you squat. You unrack the bar, you're going to take a step or two back away from the rack, get those feet in position, and then brace properly. And we haven't talked really about bracing, which I think is an important aspect to talk about with squats. But, step back, get in that brace position, your starting position, secure the weight, go down into that full ass-to-grass squat, come back up, repeat. And repeat as many repetitions as you're prescribed to do. Now, the brace, when we talk about bracing, what we're trying to do is increase the pressure on the vertebral column from the outside, so transverse pressure on it as opposed to a gravitational pressure pushing down on the vertebra, which tends to kind of increase the curvature. We're trying to position the vertebrae so that they are stacked on top of each other properly, have your natural curvature to your spine, and then hold that in place. Because when your spine is stacked perfectly, those curves are in place to give it greater stability as well as mobility. And so when everything is stacked properly, you're able to support more weight. Your abdominal muscles, your back muscles, all the muscles attaching that vertebra are contracting to hold that position. And then you're drawing air into your abdomen in order to put greater pressure against the vertebra as the abdominals are contracting and there's more air in there that's being pushed against the spine from the contraction of the abdominal muscles or those core muscles. You're much more secure. And in that case, you really don't need a belt, which is another thing that we can talk about. Again, this episode can go very, very long. If you're not careful, we're not going to get through all the muscles. But that bracing aspect, if you're going to use a belt, only use a belt when you're really getting into your heaviest weights. When we're talking anything, I'd say generally probably if you're going in high repetitions at 75% of your repetition maximum or your perceived repetition maximum, then that's probably a good time to use it, so that in those last few reps, you're not putting your back in a more vulnerable position. But if you're lifting really heavy in a 5x5 or fewer repetitions, the belt may be much more useful. But as you're warming up, as you're progressing up to really heavy weights, don't become reliant on a belt early on. You want to be using the belt to assist your normal bracing and just give you that added little level of protection beyond what your own body is kind of capable of. Because naturally we want to be able to, if we have to lift something heavy, we don't want to be looking around for our weight belt to be able to lift a box off the floor. Amazon makes a delivery to your front door. Well, where's my weight belt so I can get this thing in the house? You want to be able to just bend down, pick the thing up, and bring it into the house. I think we've covered about everything. There might be a few more lifts that we might have missed, and maybe those will pop up again in future conversations. But I think those are the basic essentials. And for probably most of our listeners, the people that are just looking for general fitness and muscle strength and hypertrophy to age well, they're kind of looking at a podcast like this. Those that are much more focused on, but I want to lift heavy weights, man, and enter some powerlifting competitions and stuff like that. There's some other podcasts that are out there that might get you into a little bit more of the advanced lifting. This is really geared toward the novice, intermediate lifter, the aging lifter that's just simply looking to get stronger and to be healthier. So anything else?
We talked about body weight style squats. We've talked about external weight that we're either holding or it's on our back or it's down by our side. What about resistance around the legs, like bands? I think bands could be a good tool for that novice, that beginner, and possibly in that geriatric community, but it's not a necessary thing. And the reason why I kind of wanted to bring it up is you see a lot of those social media trends and they're like, bands are great, bands are awesome, but we really don't necessarily need bands.
Well,
as far as
you've opened up a whole nother can of worms, and I'm glad I can't tell how long we've been recording for, because this is going to probably take some time. And it's probably something we maybe dive into a little bit deeper in some other conversations, but it depends how you're applying the bands. And I'm just going to go straight to what is reactive neuromuscular facilitation, or RNT, as it would be kind of labeled in like athletic training circles and strength conditioning circles. Reactive neuromuscular training is, I think, critical for learning the appropriate muscle mechanics for doing a proper squat. I use it all the time in my novice weightlifters, particularly, like a bunch of freshman wrestlers that kind of came in and their knees tend to buckle a little bit. Female athletes, I think it's essential as they learn to squat to do reactive neuromuscular training in the squat. And what we're doing is we're wrapping a band around the knees so that as they are squatting down, it is pulling the knees inward where we don't want them to go. And their response, the natural neuromuscular response, is going to be to push out against those. And so it trains the athlete or the individual to engage those gluteal muscles to abduct the hips in order to properly stabilize and help protect the knee. So with an athlete or anybody who might be at risk of ACL tears, it's generally because they have weak hips. And so if you're seeing somebody whose knees are buckling as they're squatting, wrapping a band around the legs and forcing them inward so that they resist against it is going to counter that. Another thing that I would use are, again, the same principle, but if somebody, as they're squatting, a body part is kind of moving in the wrong direction. I have a few athletes who initially they would kind of, in fact, two of them would kind of lift together and one's butt would kind of shift to the left and the other one's butt shifted to the right. And so we countered that by just taking a band, pulling them in that direction, and it causes them to contract the muscles that shift that hip back to the more neutral position. And that, again, is using bands in a proper fashion for reactive neuromuscular training. So another thing we can do with the bands is what's referred to as compensatory acceleration training. And again, that's way, way off topic for today, but essentially using the bands, or you can use like the elastic tubes to create greater resistance so that the resistance becomes greater as we concentrically contract, and it becomes less as we kind of go into the deeper part of the squat. Those can be beneficial as well. It's a much more of an advanced training technique. And so I think we'll kind of leave that for another time because we are way, way over our kind of time limit for today. And so let's just hopefully think that we've covered enough in terms of some of the basics of the variations for the squat.
I think we did.
Obviously, there's a lot more that we can dive into. But for now, and until the next episode, let's just hope everybody keeps aging well.
Aging well.
Thank you for listening. I hope you benefited from today's podcast. And until next time, keep aging well.